Hello, my name is Jonathan Farrar, and I'll be presenting today on Franz Kafka. You'll have to kind of bear with me. I'm going to have to go back and forth to not only the laptop but the computer, the stationary computer. That being said, though, let's get it going. So Franz Kafka, he was born on July 3rd, 1883 in Prague to a well-off Jewish family. He had two younger brothers that actually died in infancy. So Franz was the only boy in a home with three sisters. The relationship with his dad was very strained, but he had a decent relationship with his mother. His mother was a homemaker, and so many think that her lack of education really made it hard for her to understand what exactly Franz wanted to do with his life. His dad, on the other hand, operated a men's and women's clothing store, and so he provided very well for the family and actually did very well. The dad and son, like I mentioned, though, had a very strained relationship, and this really comes through in most of Franz's writing. Franz attended Charles Ferdinand University in Prague. He originally was a chemistry major and switched to law very shortly after arriving. As a biology and chemistry major myself, I think it just shows how intelligent Franz actually was. Got out of that science major really quick. Franz, upon graduation, worked at an insurance institute for a short time before he quit to begin writing. And it's also important to remember, even though Franz was Jewish, he was very heavily influenced by German culture, and German was actually his first language. The timeline I think it's always really important to understand the time period that you're working with, but also whenever you're dealing with an individual, kind of their time frame. So Franz, like I said, was born in 1883. He started school in 1889. He went to university and graduated in 1906. He didn't begin writing his first novel until 1912, and his death came shortly thereafter in 1924. So it's really important to remember with Franz Kafka, you don't have a large period of time. It's one of those, he had 12 years of writing. So unlike some people that started very young or started very old, you might have a larger or smaller sample size. You don't really have that with Franz because he wasn't around for very long. The first book that we're going to talk about, we're going to look at 5 books that Franz Kafka wrote, the first of which is The Judgment. Franz himself described this book as a total opening of body and soul. He actually wrote this in one sitting, which to me is amazing. I find it hard to write a paper, much less an entire novel, in just one sitting. He did this, though, whenever he was 29 years old. He used his relationship with his father to write this book. The book actually is pretty much based on that relationship, and it was very strained, a very tough relationship, and it really comes through very well in the writing. Franz said that whenever he sat down and started writing this, he was in almost a semi-conscious state, which allowed for his true feelings to flow. So I think that really emphasizes how strained the relationship with him and his father really was, because he was in a semi-conscious state, and so if he felt like he had to be in that state to accurately describe that relationship, it really says a lot about how bad it must have been. This work, The Judgment, is actually the breakthrough piece. You know, you hear that term all the time. You know, if you're a sports fan, you hear it with rookies, you know, that breakthrough game. Or if you're an actress or an actor, or you're into movies, you know, you hear about that breakthrough role. Well, this, for Franz, was his breakthrough book. The Metamorphosis, which is by far the most famous piece and was actually extremely well covered in the lecture video, was written in 1912. The same year as The Judgment. This is actually about a salesman that's transformed into an insect. I thought it was really interesting that it was a salesman. I thought that maybe that was a relationship to his father, since his father was in retail and sold men's and women's clothing. But this work really examines the absurdity of life. So with that in mind, this book showed Franz his feelings of anxiety and inferiority. These were both complexes that he really struggled with, He often felt very anxious about his appearance and often felt like he wasn't worthy of things because of his physical appearance. This really comes through in this story. Um, the Metamorphosis, the story itself, is considered to be Franz's best work, but it's also considered to be one of the best works of all time. Some people say that it's the best work of his generation and possibly of any generation. This book, in general, is where you can really see his style being born. You know, the other book was his breakthrough. Well, this was the one that really solidified his place. His honest dialogue of inner psyche is what really came out, and that's really what he used and based his style on. So it's this inner dialogue of the inner workings of your own psyche. And I think that's part of the reason why it appealed to people and still appeals to people, is because he went after the things that make us all human. This next work, The Stoker, is he also used personal things in this book. He used his family experience. He had several family members that actually immigrated to the United States, and that's actually how he got the idea for this book and based this book off of them. This book started to show him maturing as a writer. The first two were very early on, and even though one was his breakthrough and one was eventually his most important piece, this was the one that started to show him mature. He started to try new things. Instead of being real dark and glum, he started trying comedy and things with positive endings, and it really comes through in The Stoker. The Stoker it's amazed me in the fact that this work was actually the first chapter of an entire novel that he actually didn't write. So this book was actually supposed to be, he had a completely different idea, but he was willing and open-minded enough to allow this to just become it. The Stoker, like I said, was based off of his family. And that's one thing, a lot of writers that we've examined, you don't really know where their inspiration comes from. You know, some of them it's all themselves, or it's all what's happening in society. But I really like that Franz was able to take his family and take all of his surroundings as well as his inner self and really produce that in his writings. The next work that we're going to look at is The Trial. This book was written in 1914 to 1915, so this one took him some time. It wasn't one of those he sat down and wrote it in one sitting. It's really important to remember in this book, he never once describes the actual crime. So you never know what the person is on trial for. In this book, whenever you're reading it, it really shows the paranorma and emotional instability that Franz had. So in this book, which is kind of a theme throughout all of his books, it's really showing his flaws. He actually dedicated this book to his fiancée. Franz was engaged twice but never married. It was actually to the same woman. I don't know how he got away with that one, and I don't know how he kept her coming back. But Franz dedicated this book to her and said that this was the story of her life, which I found really interesting. I don't know if that was stating that it was their relationship or that's just how he viewed her. But he never stated the crime. So I don't know if Franz just had trust issues that stemmed back to possibly his father, or if it was one of those he really didn't understand women in general or just life in general or trust himself enough to make a commitment. But nonetheless, this book was dedicated to his two-time fiancée. Franz actually called off the engagement when he got sick the second time, and so he actually passed away shortly thereafter. The next book we're going to look at is The Castle, and he never finished this work. This was a book that Franz started, but actually passed away before he was able to finish writing it. The main theme of this book is a man fighting the power, so to speak, which if you follow through all of his books, it has that same kind of energy to it. This whole, we got to fight the man fighting the power, a solo person battling the greater cause, so to speak. It's very much like the theme in the book The Stoker. This book the underlying tone is just surrealism, which I think might stem from the root of his health condition. I think the fact that Franz was in such bad health, that really attributed to the fact that this book was written in a very surreal manner, because that was probably the mindset that he was in. I think most of the works that Franz did, you can really take a step back and look at where he was at in his personal life and just in his health, and that really attributes to most of his writing. And also, I think a large factor is the relationship with his father. I really think that that comes through in most of his works. One really interesting fact about this book is it actually ends mid-sentence. So it's not like he was at a stopping point that he was comfortable with, or even the reader would probably be comfortable with. But so the last chapter, the last sentence of this novel ends mid-sentence. Kafka actually inspired a lot of people and actually did some drawings of his own. As you can see here, this is The Runner, which he worked on from 1907 to 1908. It's very abstract. I know it's probably very hard to tell on the video, but whenever you look at it, you can kind of tell if you know the title, if you can see the title, you can make out what it is. But it's very much just one color, black on white paper. So it's very, very interesting that this was the type of artwork he was into, but I think it really translates into his writing style. This is Horse and Rider, another work that Franz did himself. This was done in 1909 to 1910. Once again, I apologize. I know that this one might be a little bit easier to make out, but the video is probably not very great quality. This one, whenever I looked at it, I thought it was a praying mantis. I'm not going to lie, it was very hard to see the horse and rider. But once again, I think that this really speaks to how Franz wrote and how he just viewed things. He was very abstract, and that was something at that time that was kind of starting to grab hold, but he really inspired this change in this movement. Kafkaesque is a word that's actually contributed straight to him. This, to me, this describes his style. I think fair terms to describe his style, it would be things such as gothic and dark and things like that. But the definition of Kafkaesque is having nightmarish, complex, bizarre, or illogical quality. So if you think about this, all these works were very dark and kind of disturbing words. Words that I used to describe them was anxiety and fear and things of that nature. A couple things that have used this word. I'm actually a big Breaking Bad fan, and the word Kafkaesque actually comes up in one of the episodes, and I never even thought about it until I started looking at it. But that really describes the entire series, much less that one instance that it was used. But it's having nightmarish qualities, complex or bizarre. There's a few films and other TV shows that are based solely on this principle. The film Brazil, which is an older film, and the TV show The Prisoner, both are described as Kafkaesque works. And there's a couple of authors that come later that, in my opinion, very well fit the bill of what Kafkaesque is. Edgar Allan Poe, who's a very famous writer, I feel like is a very Kafkaesque writer because he really went after dreams and nightmares. He really appealed to that dark, disturbing place, and he focused on things such as anxiety as well. Peter Straub, the author of Black House, is another person that really has Kafkaesque come through very greatly in his writings. One other thing I found very interesting, I'm a bit of a nerd and I like to research things, and one thing I've always looked at was the West Memphis Three. And the West Memphis Three was described during one of the court sessions as Kafkaesque teenagers, and I never knew what that meant until I actually started reviewing this. And actually, after looking at it some more, I found out what it meant, and so it really applies to the terminology of just this dark thing. And I think that that's actually what he was trying to appeal as. Franz Kafka was one of the best writers of his time, maybe even the best of his time, and he really inspired this horror movie type persona to really transpire. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and that's all I have.